Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Conversations in Environmental Communication series here at the Program on the Environment at the University of Washington. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'm your host for this evening. We've got a fantastic guest with us tonight. We have Dr. John Cook, author and assistant professor at George Mason University. Dr. Cook is the founder of Skeptical Science and an author of Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, How to Understand and Respond to Climate Science Deniers. And he'll be sharing his perspective on how we can build resilience to climate misinformation and provide insights on how to engage others in discussions about climate change. Before we begin with that, though, I'd like to start off by saying that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land. I'm joining you from the Seattle campus on the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And on a more personal note, as a settler on the unceded homeland of the Duwamish people, past, present, and future, I express my gratitude to the Duwamish tribe and support their efforts to regain federal recognition. As I said, we've got a great event scheduled for you this evening. I do want to just also say that as we move forward with this event, since some of us are in the Zoom and others will be joining live on YouTube, that if you're joining us within the Zoom at intervals, our guest will be stopping the presentation to ask for questions. If you have questions, you can raise your digital hand at that time and we can call on you. You could turn on your camera even and ask your questions live, or you can enter your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to relay those questions at the appropriate time. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can certainly use the chat function within YouTube to enter your comments and questions there, and I can go ahead and relay those to our guest as well. All right, so as I said, our guest is John Cook. He's an author and assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, researching cognitive science. In 2007, he founded Skeptical Science, a website which won the 2011 Australian Museum Eureka Prize for the advancement of climate change knowledge, and a 2016 Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education. John co-authored and published a number of high-profile textbooks and papers on climate change. In 2015, he developed a massive open online course at the University of Queensland on climate science denial that received over 25,000 enrollments. Wow. His latest book is Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, How to Understand and Respond to Climate Science Deniers. And I do apologize for the little delay we had getting online. And I want to go ahead and just welcome John. Let's give him a big round of digital and real applause if we can. And I will turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the invitation to speak and for the introduction too. If I could start on a slightly negative note, just to fact check one little element in your introduction. I'm based at Monash University now. I've moved back to Australia. So,
oh my goodness, I am so sorry. I did not, I'll make a note of that.
I was at George Mason from 2017 to 2020. I started at George Mason a week after the presidential inauguration and then left just after the next presidential inauguration. So it was certainly an interesting 4 years. So I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully my slides will be coming up about now. And just to give you a preview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go through 3 research papers that I published with my colleagues at George Mason, at the University of Washington, and all over the place. Research into how to more effectively counter misinformation. And then I'm going to talk about how we've tried to take these various research findings and put them into practice in a practical public engagement project, and just some of the results we've seen with that. So as I'm talking through my research, please, feel free to post questions, and I'm going to pause at the end of each description of each research paper to address any questions that you might have. The first paper I want to talk about delves into a branch of psychological research called Inoculation Theory. I'd been grappling during my PhD with this question: how do you effectively counter misinformation? And I was actually presenting some of my experiment results at a psychology conference in Sydney, and somebody said, "That sounds a lot like inoculation theory." And I was like, "What's that?" And quickly after the talk went and looked up what he was talking about. And it turns out the research I was doing wasn't something that I'd come up with, which, many PhD students think that they have. People a lot smarter than me had figured this out 50 years ago. Inoculation theory takes the principles of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. Researchers have found that just as exposing people to a weakened form of a virus can build up their immunity so that when they encounter the actual virus, they're less likely to get infected, in the same way, you can expose people to a weakened form of misinformation, and then that helps build up their cognitive immunity so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, they're less likely to be misled. In my own research, I found that I published a paper in 2017 in PLOS ONE where we experimented with inoculating people against misinformation about climate change. So this was with my two PhD supervisors, Stefan Lewandowski and Ulrich Ecker. And this is the misinformation that we included in our experiment. This is actual misinformation taken from a live website, the Global Warming Petition Project. This website features over 31,000 Americans with a science degree who have signed a statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. And the point of this website, of this petition, is to argue, look at all these experts who have signed this statement. That proves that there's no scientific consensus that humans are causing global warming. In my experiment, I tested what happens when people are just shown this misinformation. What is the impact on their perceptions about climate change? And these are the results. In this graph, the y-axis, the vertical axis, is change in their perceived climate perceptions. Specifically in this graph, their perceived scientific consensus, the consensus amongst climate scientists that humans are causing global warming. So anything below the dotted line in this means that their climate perceptions have gone down. The misinformation has had a negative effect. The horizontal axis here is political ideology. People to the right are more right-wing and people to the left are more left-wing. And what I found was that the misinformation did have a negative effect, but the effect wasn't the same across the entire population. People who were more politically conservative were more influenced by the misinformation, while people who were on the left end of the political spectrum, the misinformation didn't have really much effect at all. So what this tells us is two things. Firstly, misinformation does have an impact. It does overall reduce people's perceptions about climate change, but also because it has different effects across the political spectrum, misinformation about climate change has a polarizing effect. As misinformation washes over the population, it splits people apart in their climate beliefs, and they end up further apart in their beliefs and more polarized, which can have a lot of implications down the track. I'm happy to come back to that issue of why polarization is problematic. In my experiment, one group just saw this misinformation, but a second group was shown an inoculating message before they were shown the misinformation. And here's an excerpt from the inoculating message in our experiment. And a key element of this inoculation was it didn't mention the Global Warming Petition Project at all. Instead, what I focused on was explaining the technique used to mislead people. So what was the misleading rhetorical technique in the misinformation? And doing this effectively, like exposing the sleight of hand in a magician's trick, this is how you deliver misinformation in a weakened form, by making people more aware of how the misinformation misleads. I also use tobacco as an analogy to make this more concrete, showing examples from the mid-20th century when the tobacco industry were using fake experts to confuse the public about the science of smoking causing health problems. What I found after people were first inoculated, then shown the misinformation, and then I measured their climate perceptions, the blue line shows those results. And overall, the misinformation was neutralized. There's a slight slope to the line, but statistically it's equivalent to a flat line, which means that when people were inoculated and then shown the misinformation, no matter where they sat on the political spectrum, the misinformation didn't have any impact. What this tells us is that regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, nobody likes being misled. Aversion to being deceived is a bipartisan feeling. And this work also tells us that you can inoculate people against a specific piece of misinformation without even actually mentioning it. Just by explaining the technique used to mislead, that can inoculate people across different topics, which means that this approach, which we call logic-based inoculation, because we're explaining the logical fallacies or the techniques used in misinformation, logic-based inoculation is kind of like a universal vaccine against misinformation because it can work across topics. So I think that and so the last thing I'll say about that is, given that explaining the techniques used to mislead is a key tool in building public resilience against misinformation, inoculating them against being misled, it's important to have a framework for explaining the rhetorical techniques of misinformation. And I found the most practical and useful framework I've found is FLIC, the 5 techniques of science denial. FLIC standing for fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Having an acronym like that makes it quite easy to remember. I might just pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions, whether in the chat or if anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question.
Great. If you have any questions for Dr. Cook, now would be a great time. And just, I'll just once again say, I'm sorry for my own misinformation and mentioning that you were at George Mason when you were in fact at Monash University's Climate Change Communication Research Hub. I see that Jasmine's got her hand up. Jasmine, do you have a question?
Yeah, how did you decide who you were going to include in the study?
Yeah, that's a good question. In this experiment, we asked for a representative sample of US citizens. So typically the way they do that is, I think we use Qualtrics to recruit our participants. Qualtrics is a survey panel. And so we just say, we want a group of people whose distribution of age, gender, education level perhaps, and general geography match the US population. So what they're giving us is roughly what you would get amongst the US public. We've also we've done similar experiments in Australia, asking for a representative sample of Australians and get similar kinds of results.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Catherine, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if you ever noticed if misinformation groups used that same sort of like inoculation framework to try to implement misinformation, and whether that is a barrier or if there's a way to counteract that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are 3 main types of inoculation. The one I've just explained is logic-based inoculation. Another is fact-based inoculation, where you can potentially inoculate people by giving them explanations of the facts. And if they understand the science well enough, then when they hear a myth about the science, they can see through it. For example, explain how the greenhouse effect works. And if they understand that, and then they hear someone casting doubt on the greenhouse effect, if their understanding is strong enough, they will ideally be able to see through that misinformation. So there's logic-based, there's fact-based, and the third type of inoculation is source-based, where you show how a source of misinformation is unreliable or discredited or have a bad track record. The problem is the source-based approach can be used in unethical ways too, through ad hominem attacks, accusing people of being biased or deceptive. And it's actually one of the most common forms of misinformation about climate change, ad hominem attacks directed against climate scientists. Separate to this, last November, we published some machine learning research where we used machine learning to identify all the different types of climate misinformation in order to see what are the main arguments being used. And ad hominem attacks on climate scientists, as well as attacks on climate science itself, such as arguing that climate models are unreliable, or you can't trust climate data like surface temperature measurements. Those were by far the biggest category of climate misinformation. And that's essentially source-based inoculation. It's saying you can't trust what those climate scientists are saying because they're politically biased, or they're in it for the money, or they've been deceiving you, or it's all a hoax. And that can be an effective form of misinformation because it builds distrust. It means that when the climate scientists do try to communicate information to the public, amongst some of them, they'll just distrust what they're saying. And it can even backfire sometimes. So yeah, that's problematic. I would say that one of the most effective inoculation campaigns in recent times is the fake news talking point, arguing, well, that's just fake news. President Trump used that a lot, and he basically inoculated a third of the population against any mainstream media article that painted him in a bad light. So that was a very broad and effective example of inoculating the public. Unfortunately, it has a lot of negative drawbacks because it just breeds distrust of mainstream media, of institutions, of scientists and experts. Part of the reason why we've had a lot of, like, I'm not saying it's the only reason, but a contributing factor or something that softened the ground in the last few years so that the public were distrustful of experts about COVID and vaccination was decades of attacking the science of climate change and breeding science denial, conspiracy theories, and distrust of science. That work has kind of softened the ground for some of the misinformation and distrust that we're experiencing now. To answer your last question, what do we do about it? There is a little bit of research into what my colleagues call meta-inoculation. So in other words, what psychology nerds call this type of approach. Meta-inoculation is inoculating people against inoculations. And what it involves is basically making people aware of what's happening. When people are saying, don't trust them, it's fake news, don't trust the scientists, they're politically biased, make them aware of those ad hominem techniques and how they're trying to breed distrust in you. Really, it's similar in approach to the logic-based inoculation. Build people's resilience against misinformation by building their awareness of the techniques used to mislead.
That's really fascinating. Thank you, John. I know that we probably want to move on with your presentation, although there are two questions in the chat that are sort of similar in looking at that graphic that you just showed us. It was really interestingly showing us the left and the right. one of the things that came up in this is, of course, you have liberal on the left, you have conservative on the right, but Ava asks about folks who don't necessarily affiliate strongly with either the liberal side of the spectrum or the conservative side. Does this pattern still hold? What happens when we're talking about sort of independence and the like?
Yeah, so I mean, what we found was I guess the orange line kind of most clearly communicates that, in that people on the ends of the political spectrum tend to be fairly rusted on with their attitudes about climate change, and which means that that people on the further to the left are supportive of climate change, and misinformation that cast doubt on it, they're more likely to dismiss. Conversely, people on the right are more skeptical of climate change, they're more conducive or open to misinformation, and they're also more closed to accurate information. People in the middle tend to be more flexible in their beliefs. There's this delicious graph, I don't have it in my slides here, but there was a study found that found that overall the public are subtly influenced by the temperature on that day, and that influences their attitudes about climate change. They found that when you do a survey asking people about whether they think global warming is happening, if it's a hot day, they're more likely to say yes, and if it's a cold day, they're more likely to say no, even though the weather at a single place on a single day, logically, it shouldn't have an impact on our attitudes about global climate change, but humans are influenced by our environment to a degree we don't even realize. But when you go deeper into the data, you see this really interesting pattern. Republicans and Democrats aren't influenced by temperature. Democrats are accepting of the reality of climate change, regardless of whether it's a hot day or a cold day. Republicans are less accepting of the reality of climate change, regardless of hot or cold. But all the movement is amongst independents. So if it's cold, the independents are less accepting of global warming. And if it's hot, they're more accepting. So they're just more fluid in their attitudes about climate change. So from a communication point of view, the consequence of this is inoculation theory and this approach of inoculating people against misinformation. It's not really for changing the minds of people who are dismissive about climate change, who are less than 10% of the population anyway. It's more for the people in the middle, the disengaged, the cautious, or maybe even the doubtful, who are about 30% of the population. And it's about inoculating them so that they're less likely to be misled by the misinformation coming from that 10% of dismissives.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Did you say there were two questions, or shall I proceed?
Oh, I think they both kind of dealt with the same thing. Maybe we can hold the remainder and move
Sure.
on. I don't want to fall too far behind. Thank you.
Great. So the second paper I wanted to talk about was research I began once I'd moved to George Mason University and met Sojung Kim and Emily Vraga. Emily was based at George Mason at the time as well. She's now since moved to Minnesota. And we were looking at, well, how do you put inoculation into practice? What are practical ways, engaging and effective ways to explain the techniques of misinformation? And we decided to test two different techniques and also use eye tracking to measure what people were paying attention to while they were looking at our corrections. Now, here is an example. We actually tested this across climate change, vaccination. This is back, I think, 2018, long before the pandemic, and gun control misinformation. But we found the biggest effects with vaccination, where people's views were not quite as hard, strongly formed. So in this, this is an example of some information we showed to people in our experiment. The top part here is a tweet showing some vaccination misinformation. And then the bottom part is a correction or debunking explaining the fallacy in the misinformation. And we basically explained the technique in the misinformation in two different ways. One was a non-humorous approach. That's this one, using a critical thinking approach. Here is the argument. Here is the fallacy in the argument. The second technique we used to explain the fallacies was humorous. And we basically used an approach introduced to me by some critical thinking philosophers called parallel argumentation. The idea here is you take the logical flaw in the misinformation and you transplant it into a parallel situation in order to make clearer the fallacy in the original myth. So here the fallacy is someone got vaccinated and then suffered some injury, so the vaccine must have caused it. And just jumping back, that's mistaking correlation or two things happening close to each other with causation. That logic is the same as saying, I was wearing these clothes while watching a sporting game and we won, therefore what I was wearing must have influenced the sporting game, which is obviously a ridiculous argument. Although when I showed this design to my wife, she said, no, people actually believe that. So maybe it's not as ridiculous as you think it is. Anyway, we tested both these approaches, and interestingly, we found they both were effective in neutralizing the misinformation. And so then we looked at the eye tracking data and we did some mediation analysis to understand why either method was effective in countering the misinformation. With mediation analysis, you have your final variable you're interested in. In our case, we were interested in their belief in the myth and whether we could reduce it. But there were a few other variables that we measured, and mediation analysis lets you explore, do any of these mediating variables or these variables in the middle, do they have an influence on the final variable? In other words, are they the pathway through which the misinformation is successfully debunked? We found that with the non-humorous condition, the serious critical thinking condition, the variable that did the mediating, in other words, the pathway through which we were able to debunk the myth, was the credibility of that correction tweet. In other words, people perceived that correction as having higher credibility compared to the humorous tweet. But when we looked at the eye tracking data, we found that people looked at the cartoon and the humorous correction much longer than they looked at the other serious correction. And it was that greater attention which mediated the cartoon debunking the myth. In other words, different approaches to debunking misinformation can work in different ways. Some of them work because they're more credible. Others work because they hold people's attention for longer. But it means that there's no one magic bullet or a single approach to countering misinformation. There are different approaches. They can both be effective, but through different pathways. I think that's all I was going to say about this research. I'm happy to answer any questions before moving on to my third study.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, John. That's really fascinating. I love the way that you did that, and the eye tracking work that's really quite interesting. If you have questions for John about that research study, it would be great to put those questions in the chat or raise your digital hand and we can ask those questions right now.
I will say that that approach of parallel argumentation, or nowadays I tend to call them logic analogies, when the critical thinking philosophers introduced that to me, a light bulb moment for me was realizing that this was a technique that I was seeing every night from late night comedians, Colbert and Seth Meyers and Trevor Noah. They would often debunk whatever misinformation was being promoted that day by saying such and such public figure said this. Well, that's just like being in this situation, and then using the same logic. But in this extreme absurd situation, everyone would laugh. They would instantly see the logical flaw in the original argument. And it was a very entertaining and engaging way to explain how misinformation is misleading. And it very elegantly also enabled you to sidestep necessarily having to explain all the facts and all the information. Ideally, you do want to be able to explain all the facts to people, but this logic-based approach to just explaining the misleading technique in misinformation can be quite elegant as well, because you can just cut to explaining how the misinformation is misleading. Lastly, I'll say that prior to doing my PhD, I actually spent around over a decade doing cartooning for a living. And so when I realized that this humorous approach was really powerful, it was kind of like my Dorothy from Wizard of Oz moment, where I realized I had the ability to solve this problem all along. And that's why we started using cartoons as a potential technique in experiments.
Yeah, no, that it's really fantastic, and I know what you mean. I think I just watched an episode of John Oliver, and his use of analogy is always really perfect for cutting through some of the misinformation that he discusses. One question I had, you mentioned that the cartoons, people maybe thought of them as well, perhaps less serious. Did you look at different styles? Was there any, in terms of the cartoon, was it, I know that you draw these cartoons, which are fantastic, but did you look at whether or not there was anything about the drawings themselves that might have impacted the way people viewed them?
Not in this research. I've worked with some other colleagues from Utah who have looked at different types of humor, and they've used different types of cartoons. And they're specifically interested in types of humor such as anthropomorphism, like turning objects into, walking, talking people. Satire, what was the other ones? Wordplay, kind of like dad jokes. And testing whether these different types of humor were more effective in explaining science to people. So we've done a few experiments there. We did one with autonomous cars, and just having a cartoon of a car versus having a car with eyes and mouths talking. And the results are kind of mixed. It's hard to tease apart whether there's one particular type of humor that is effective. And that's not quite answering your question, because we didn't look at different styles so much, more different types of humor. Yeah. But I think that this is really kind of using humor and cartoons in science communication is, as this is the phrase all of us scientists say, it's an understudied topic. Much more research is needed.
Well, if you find that dad jokes are a good way to teach anyone science, that would be great. I would love that information, because it would really help me out with my daughter. Anyway, I'll let you continue. We'll go ahead and hold the questions for the next vignette.
Sure. So the third study looked more closely at two different types of inoculation, and I've already mentioned them: fact-based and logic-based inoculations. I've actually not done really any research testing source-based inoculation because, I'm a little bit queasy about it. I think fact-based and logic-based are much more ethical ways of neutralizing misinformation, although there is a place for exposing discredited sources, but it's not something I've studied much. What we did in our, is that it? There we go. What we did was we debunked the myth that CO2 is plant food. Plants need CO2 as part of their photosynthesis process in order to grow. because plants need CO2, therefore we should emit more CO2, and that will be good for plants. So we were debunking that myth, but we debunked it in two different ways. One was by explaining the facts of what plants need in order to grow, that not just CO2, but a range of other different conditions as well. And both of these cartoons here use analogies. One was using an analogy to explain the facts of that plants are kind of picky. They have these very specific conditions that they need. Oh, and a dad joke, actually, now that you mention it, with the prickly wordplay. And the logic-based approach, now that I think about it, combining wordplay with the there's a lot of confounds in that experimental design in hindsight. I hadn't thought about that until now. The second condition was logic-based, explaining the fallacy in that argument, which is oversimplification. Saying that plants just need CO2 is like saying calcium is good for human health, so all we need to eat is ice cream, which has calcium in it. And we obviously know that that's a ridiculous argument. We need a balanced diet. In the same way, plants need a balanced diet too. They need a healthy temperature range, a regular water supply, as well as CO2. And emitting CO2 disrupts those first two conditions. Climate change disrupts the temperature range and water supply. So the other thing we did in this experiment was not only did we manipulate the type of inoculation, fact-based or logic-based, we also manipulated the order in which people got the correction or the myth. So they either got the correction first, so it was an inoculation or a pre-bunking before they got the myth, or we flipped it. They got the myth first, and then they got the correction as a debunking. So pre-bunking versus debunking. So we had these 4 different conditions, as well as a control group where they weren't shown anything. And here is the results from our experiment. Now, what this graph shows is people's belief in the climate myth. So, in other words, believing that because plants need CO2, we should emit more CO2. The higher the value is, the worse it is. Like, we don't want them believing the myth. And so you see that when people were just shown the misinformation by itself, that's where their belief in the myth was highest. Now, when people were shown the fact-based approach, in other words, explaining the facts of what plants need to grow, we find that order matters. If the fact-based correction came last, that's the blue bar here, it was effective in reducing people's belief in the myth. But if the myth was the last thing that people saw, then the myth cancelled out the facts. And what this tells us is facts can be vulnerable to the existence of misinformation. When people encounter facts and myths, we don't know what order they're going to see it in. We don't know what their conditions are or what their information landscape is. And there is the danger, like with this green bar here, that the misinformation might cancel out our facts, our education, our attempts to communicate the facts to people. With the logic-based correction, order didn't matter. Whether the myth came first or the myth came last, the logic-based correction was effective in reducing people's belief in this myth. And so what these results tell us is this logic-based approach, building people's critical thinking, makes them more robust against misinformation. The logic-based approach is more robust than the fact-based approach. That's not to say that we should only focus on the logic-based approach. Generally, I try to do both. I try to explain to people, here are the facts. Here is a technique used to distort those facts, combining the fact-based and the logic-based approach. But just being aware of the fact that that misinformation can cancel out our factual explanations is important. It tells us that just pure factual explanations, while necessary, are insufficient if we want to build public resilience against misinformation. I think that's all I was going to say about this study, yes. So I might pause there and see if there's any further questions before jumping into the final stage of my presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, John. That was really interesting. There are a couple of questions here that may be relevant. Julia asked earlier, in terms of education, when is a good time to inoculate students for misinformation? And it sounds like to me, since so much of what you just told us about logic-based sort of pre-bunking and debunking, do you think that it's really just a matter of us doing more of teaching critical thinking skills and sort of understanding logic and fallacy, that we need to be doing that maybe earlier in education? Or what is your thought there?
We're collecting data on that very question at the moment. So I can't give you a quantitative answer. I can give you a hand-wavy, gut instinct kind of answer. We are finding that, and I'll go into this in more detail in a moment, but our practical project to put all this into practice is mainly being adopted at the high school level. I was originally thinking this was kind of a college level thing, but it's actually high school, particularly 11 and 12 teachers are implementing this approach. But what has surprised me is we've actually had teachers signing up across a really wide age range, all the way down to elementary school. Not that many, it's mostly high school. There's some middle school, there's a small number of elementary, but then there's also college, and then there's even grad level. So it's this one thing that I'm about to talk about is being applied from elementary school to PhD students, which is kind of fascinating. What I really want to do is quantitatively look at the effectiveness at these different age levels, but we just need more data to get that granular. But 17 years old is the peak age at which we're seeing people using this game that I'm about to talk about. So I think that generally, to answer your question, I think that we do need to be teaching critical thinking at high school and ideally middle school levels, as well as college as well, because we're finding in our data that college, at least undergrads, are getting roughly the same scores on our critical thinking quiz as senior high school. So I don't think the critical thinking is really taught much at any age level. So even in college. So I think we do need to be teaching this in college, but ideally as well in high school and middle school.
Fascinating. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, and Polly asks another really interesting question. How long do inoculation effects last? So do people drift back towards a tendency to embrace denialist misinformation after the immediacy of an inoculation fades? Do you see any sort of drift? And does it depend on if it's fact-based or logic-based?
Yeah, again, I can give you a much more definitive answer to that question in about 6 months, because we actually got some funding from Facebook, of all places, to do a longitudinal study. In other words, all the experiments I've just talked about now have been instantaneous. They do everything in the one session, and it's much more expensive to do a study where you recruit your 1,000 participants, and then 2 weeks or 4 weeks later, you email them and say, hey, can you do a follow-up survey now? Because you only get a percentage of them, and you have to recruit that much more at the beginning in order to get the required number at the end. So that costs a lot more. We've got some funding to actually test this exact paradigm, fact-based versus logic-based, immediately after the debunking, but then probably 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks after that, we'll go back and ask them again. But the existing literature has found that, yes, there is a decay, there is a drift, and inoculations do wear off over time, which means that you can continue the analogy. People do need booster shots. You do need to provide booster inoculations. And that dynamic of needing to kind of have a regular contact is another reason why the game approach I'm about to talk about has some advantages that make it easier to be able to be regularly giving people boosters.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'll let you proceed then. Thank you.
Great. All right. So getting back to Flick, now the 5 techniques of science denial. Those 5 techniques are actually the tip of the iceberg. And underneath that, there are a whole range of rhetorical techniques, logical fallacies. These, all the orange icons here are logical fallacies, and traits of conspiratorial thinking. The purple icons here are the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. I actually spent about 2 or 3 hours on a flight from Australia to the US coming up with an acronym for the 7 traits. Conspire was the best I could do. It took me hours to get there. But yeah, so the challenge with these techniques of science denial is there are so many of them, and even this taxonomy here is not complete. I'm actually about to add 2 more because we're doing some work on vaccine myths now, and we need to add appeal to nature, and one I showed earlier today, which was the post hoc, or I think the Latin is post hoc ergo propter hoc, or I forget it. My Latin is not very good. And so these are a lot of different techniques. And from a communication and education point of view, it is quite the challenge to not only make people aware of them all, but internalize them deeply enough that when they encounter misinformation out in the wild, watching TV, see a social media post, having a conversation, can they spot these different techniques in real time when they do an argument, when they're trying to analyze an argument? And basically what we're trying to do is get people critical thinking, to be able to analyze arguments and spot different rhetorical techniques. And critical thinking is hard. There's a book by Daniel Kahneman, Fast and Slow Thinking, or Slow and Fast Thinking, I forget which way it goes, but he basically talks about these 2 ways that people think. This is fundamental to human psychology. There's slow thinking, which is slowing down and thinking through complicated problems, and analyzing an argument is an example of slow thinking. Critical thinking is slow thinking. Then there's fast thinking, which is immediate gut instinct reactions. We call them heuristics or mental shortcuts, or emotional responses are included in that. And almost all of our thinking is fast thinking because it's easy, it's quick, and it's instinctive. But we're trying to get people to do more slow thinking or critical thinking, which our brains are not well hardwired to do. We can do it, but it's not easy. So how do we overcome this basic fundamental psychological challenge? It turns out that games offer a really powerful set of tools to be able to overcome this psychological challenge. And so over the last few years, I've been developing this game, Cranky, which is a critical thinking smartphone game. We launched it in December 2020. So we actually crowdfunded it at the start of 2020, raised enough funds for the app developers to build the game, and then we launched it at the end of 2020. And the game basically takes all the principles from the psychological research that I've described to you, logic-based inoculation, Flick, the 5 techniques of science denial, which you see in the rightmost screen here, and using humor, using cartoon analogies or parallel argumentation, and combining all those communication approaches with gamification. There are two elements to the Cranky Uncle game. The first element is explaining the techniques of science denial. So basically, Cranky Uncle is like a mentor. He's mentoring you on how to become a science-denying cranky uncle yourself. So he says, well, here's how I dismiss science. I use anecdotes, I cherry pick, I use conspiracy theories, and he explains all the different techniques in the Flick taxonomy. And then the game uses parallel arguments or logic analogies. For example, arguing that cold weather disproves global warming is the same as arguing that nighttime disproves that the sun exists. Obviously a ridiculous argument, but exactly the same logic as the cold weather disproving global warming. So first, the game explains the techniques of science denial. It's making people aware of them. But then there's still that psychological barrier, that fast thinking versus slow thinking challenge. And the way that the game overcomes that is through practice. The game gets you practicing critical thinking by showing you examples of misinformation, whether it's a text example or using cartoons, and you have to identify what is the fallacy in that argument. When you start, it's difficult. You have to think through it. You have to do slow thinking. But the more you practice, the more that slow thinking task becomes quick thinking. And Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Fast and Slow Thinking, actually talks about a third type of thinking, which he calls expert heuristics. When an expert who does a difficult, complicated task that requires slow thinking, when the expert practices that task enough times, it then becomes a quick, easier task. A heart surgeon, after they've done thousands of surgeries, can look at a very complicated situation and make an immediate assessment based on all their practice and experience. In the same way, games can motivate people to practice critical thinking over and over and over again. And the more they practice, the more further they get into the game, the more inoculated they become against misinformation, the better they get and the easier it gets to spot all these different rhetorical techniques. And the game uses all the tools of gamification, collecting points, leveling up. We wrap humor into it. You're collecting cranky points. And every time you level up, your mood gets a little bit crankier. You start off agreeable, then you get a little bit huffy, then you get peevish and great. I had to basically use thesaurus.com to get as many different words for cranky and then try to work out which were crankier and work out the different levels in the game. Once we launched the game, I realized that the place where the game would have its biggest impact was in the classroom. And so I started building resources for teachers. In January 2021, I published the Teacher's Guide to Cranky Uncle, which is kind of a written version of this presentation. I went through the research informing the game, but then I included a whole bunch of different classroom activities that teachers could use to combine with the game in order to reinforce these critical thinking lessons. And I set up this URL, sks.to/cranky class, where teachers could sign up for a group code. So they can give a group code to their students, and then students could quickly, easily, and anonymously get straight into the game and start playing it. We found that, actually, I'm not sure if that's up to date, but we found that teachers have been signing up for this game all over the US in red states and blue states. The blue dots here are K-12 schools. The red dots are college. So it's mostly K-12, but a lot of college level classes are also using the game. But what's really been gratifying is seeing the game being adopted in red states and blue states. However, we haven't cracked the decoders yet. That's been a real a real pebble in my shoe is those two states up there, not a single class yet. So we're working on that. So far, there's been 40 out of the 50 US states that have signed up to use the game in their classrooms. And as we mentioned earlier, while actually, that's probably out of date. I'm pretty sure that high schools have now will be much closer to undergrad, but K-12 added up is the biggest category compared to college level. And as I said before, 17-year-olds are the most common age of using the game. The other thing that was really surprising to me was because the game began as debunking climate misinformation, because that's been my field of research. While we were developing the game, I realized the general applicability and the fact that logic-based inoculation is like a universal vaccine against misinformation. So I broadened the game to be more about misinformation in general, but climate is still in its DNA. So there is a bit of an emphasis on climate. And so I expected that it would be climate science and environmental science classes that mostly use the game. So it was another delightful surprise that classes across a whole range of subjects have been signing up to use the game. Basically, any subject where there is misinformation needs critical thinking and needs these kind of resources, and every subject has misinformation. And that's all I was going to say about the game. That's actually the end of my presentation. But of course, happy to answer any questions about Cranky Uncle or any of the other research that I've talked about. Also, you can find out more information about the game at crankyuncle.com. I also have created a range of videos on sks.to/YouTube, where mainly it's about delving into critical thinking and better understanding the fallacies in misinformation. COVID misinformation, although I did during 2020 do a series of videos about COVID misinformation. Did I just say COVID or climate? Anyway, it's mostly climate videos, but there was this 2020 series on fallacies found in COVID misinformation. I might stop sharing there and happy to answer any more questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. Yeah, if you have any questions for John, please go ahead and either raise your hand or you can add those to the chat. And I do encourage you to check out Cranky Uncle. It's actually quite a fun game to play. One question in the chat from Ava: is it for Android as well as iPhones?
Yeah, the game's out on Android, iPhone, and also browsers, so you can just play it just in any browser. And when we launched the game, when we submitted the game to the stores, we submitted them to the Google Store and the Apple Store at the same time. And to our surprise, Google took a lot longer to approve it. But what the unfortunate side effect of that was, the Apple one was approved. We announced that, and then there was someone posted a conspiracy theory that because Apple users are much more lefty, and apparently that's why it wasn't available on Android yet. So it was one of those conspiracy theories where they interpreted the unfolding events in a way that I guess that lent into their own political biases. But yes, it's always, the point has always been to make it as widely as available as possible, so anyone with an internet connection can play the game.
No board game yet.
No, we did toy with. We have toyed with cards or Cranky card game or a Cranky board game, but that's not on the immediate horizon.
All right, thank you. Fantastic. Well, as I said, if you have any questions for our guests, please feel free to raise your digital hand, or you can add those to the chat. That would be fantastic. I know we've gone over just a little bit, and so we won't hold you up too long, John. I appreciate you bearing with us. Anna Cassini, your question.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. I was just a bit curious, following up on that discussion we had in class today. So I was wondering if you expect other scientists to counter environmental related misinformation, or whose responsibility you feel it is to follow up on.
Who's responsible for countering environmental misinformation?
Yeah, if it makes sense.
Yeah, well, what I would hope, if I had a magic wand and I got to impose my will on the world, and this kind of is an implication from some of the stuff that I've talked about today, is anyone who's in the business of communicating the facts, educating students, or doing public engagement where they're trying to communicate accurate information to people, I would ideally like anyone involved in that to also incorporate in their efforts some logic-based corrections, because our facts can be undermined by misinformation. If we want to have a more science-literate public, and we're making, we're putting all our efforts into communicating our facts, reaching as a wide audience, communicating the facts as effectively as possible, but all that effort can be undone by misinformation, cancelled out, then I think it behooves all of us to be able to communicate our facts in a way that makes it more robust. So that's why I guess one of the principles I'm trying to teach to anyone involved in science communication is your science can be cancelled out. So be aware of that. And if you're not going to factor in countering misinformation in your efforts, then you are leaving the public vulnerable to misinformation.
So ideally, any climate scientist.
Any climate scientist who's involved in communicating their science, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks.
That's talking about fallacies and flick. That's a bit of an impossible expectation, but I think that anyone at least being aware of that dynamic and having their eyes open to the danger of misinformation is important. And I have detected a reluctance amongst the natural science community to engage with the issue of misinformation and science denial, because it can get a bit ugly. And I think scientists like their ivory towers where things are quieter and calmer, whereas on the streets, so to speak, things can get a bit messier. And so I can understand that reluctance. But if we're in the business of trying to improve public science literacy, then we need to be aware of this issue.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, John. Gary, I see your hand up.
Right, I heard you ask a question. This is just brilliant applied public-facing work and very impressive in lots of ways. I actually cited your website in my class earlier this week, so it's nice to actually see you in person. You said something that just really threw me back for a minute. So I want to have you elaborate on that. More or less quoting you, you said, "I don't think there is much critical thinking taught at any level." A, I agree with you. B, at the same time, I think virtually every single colleague I have on this campus would say I teach critical thinking in one form or another. What's not happening? I mean, it sounds like what you're describing is, I would say, a massive overall failure of our educational systems.
Yeah, I don't want to, I think that climate science, and I'm guilty as charged even a couple of minutes ago, climate scientists do get kicked a bit. And so I don't want to be too hard on the academic community. And I'll also just qualify that statement by saying that critical thinking is a very broad umbrella. And what I'm talking about is just one narrow slice of it, which is argument appraisal or identifying rhetorical techniques in misinformation. More broadly, critical thinking is about assessing information, assessing data, understanding the scientific method or the different types of ways that the scientific method can work. And so it's much broader than just spotting a fallacy. And if anything, my hope is that over time, the Cranky Uncle game can evolve and add these other more sophisticated types of critical thinking into the game and do the fallacy stuff as just kind of almost the gateway drug. leading them into more advanced critical thinking. So that said, I think that all educators, I think, touch on these different elements of critical thinking, whether it's how to process data or how to come to conclusions based on the information you've got. But there's not that much on the misinformation aspect. And partly I think that might be that reluctance I mentioned earlier, that we, like, educators have a very constrained environment anyway. They have to get a lot of information conveyed in a short semester, and they trying to cram in fallacy detection or misinformation can be a challenge. So yeah, it's a tough one, I think. I guess I'll just finish by saying there is, in the educational research, there is a teaching approach called misconception-based learning. It's also called agnotology-based learning or reputational teaching, which is basically explain scientific concepts by also explaining by also explaining scientific misconceptions, or how the science can get distorted, which is basically logic-based inoculation in a classroom context. And the educational research has found this is one of the most engaging and effective ways to teach science. You get stronger learning gains, they last longer than just teaching the facts alone, and students are more engaged with it. So I think that you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can teach the science, hit all those check boxes that educators need to cram into their curriculum, but doing it in an engaged way that also incorporates critical thinking. I'm hoping that I'm trying to raise awareness of the misconception-based learning approach as well. And one way that we've done that is I wrote a textbook, co-authored a textbook with Daniel Bedford from Weber State University in Utah. Climate change, I've already forgotten the name of the book, but it's at sks.to/textbook. That's the URL of the textbook. And in that, the whole textbook is a misconception-based learning approach. Here's the facts, here is a related myth, and here is the fallacy that the myth uses to distort the facts.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. That's really interesting. I'll have to check that out as well. Well, I just want to, I'm noting the time, and I just want to be respectful of your time, John, as well as the time of our attendees. So I think what I'd like to do now is close the YouTube live stream. And again, for those of you who are joining us either on YouTube or here in the Zoom, we really appreciate you being here with us this evening. If you want to see any of the other presentations in this series, I would invite you to check out our YouTube channel and subscribe to it. Hit the little bell icon and you'll be notified when we upload new presentations, new seminars in this series. I'm going to go ahead and say good night for now, and we will see you all